Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Applied Development Economics Seminar Series. Today, we welcome Tim Dobermann from the London School of Economics. Tim is currently a PhD researcher at LSE and works in development and environmental economics. Previously, he was an economist at the International Growth Center, covering their work in Myanmar, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Jordan. Tim, thank you for joining us today. We are really looking forward to your presentation. But before we can proceed to that, let me just very quickly summarize our house rules for the audience. So Tim will have about 40 minutes to present. If you have any questions during his presentation, please post them in the Q&A function in Zoom. We will be stopping periodically for Tim to answer any clarification questions. We'll also have a dedicated 15-minute Q&A session at the end, when you can post questions both in the Q&A window, or you can use the raise hand function to indicate that you have a question. And we will then unmute you so you can ask your question live. And with this, Tim, I'll stop sharing my screen and you can start whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Farah, for the very kind introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. So I should say that it's a real privilege to be part of the seminar series. I've participated and I've looked at the past attendees, so it's really nice to be in such wise company. I think today's topic that I'll be discussing is one that we're all very familiar with in Pakistan. It raises passions. It gets a lot of people rightfully upset. It gets a lot of people thinking about what can be done to address a challenge which seems incredibly difficult. Now, I've provocatively titled this talk, Ending the Circular Debt. Unfortunately, maybe for you, I'm not going to pretend to give solutions to the problem. I think everyone, including their nanny, probably has an idea as to what needs to be done to fix the circular debt in Pakistan. But instead, what I want to do today is talk about a more conceptual approach to thinking about the issue based on experience from kind of the academic and policy world across the world, thinking about what makes an effective energy sector, what do you need to do to address some of the root challenges that we see not only in Pakistan, but elsewhere. And I want to pull from these experiences abroad to identify some lessons and apply this to the local context in Pakistan. And so in that sense, I'm framing this not as a prescription, but more as a diagnosis to get us thinking about the challenges in Pakistan and to think about potentially some ideas for moving forwards. So to start, what is the goal of ending the circular debt? The goal, from the perspective of Pakistan, is to expand access to quality, reliable energy. The expansion of energy is going to be key for growth, and this is the long run, one of the key ingredients for long run development. The question is, how do we expand this access to quality energy? We know there's many challenges, and whether you're in Pakistan, Lebanon, or Ghana, utilities across the developing world really struggle with some of the same problems that we see locally. They struggle in reducing losses as theft and non-payment is incredibly high, and overall the price of energy is often incredibly subsidized. So the starting point, which is not unique to Pakistan, is that the revenue from the distribution or the sale of electricity and energy is very low to begin with. So what I want to develop first is actually a conceptual way of thinking about how some of these problems, which we attach terms like circular debt to, how these problems emerge. And one of the core points I want to try to argue is that these mounting debts from utilities, whether it's from losses or mispriced energy, they ultimately culminate in forcing utilities to ration supply. And often we think of load shedding, so we attach terms like load shedding or kind of a deficit in generation to the idea that supply or generation capacity isn't high enough, but in reality it reflects a breakdown of the market for electricity. It's a response by utilities to reduce the supply intentionally so as to prevent further losses. So this is, of course, one view. There's other views to this point, to this question. But this is definitely one view which I want to try to substantiate today with evidence. And that really shows how, as a result of these mounting debts, you end up in an equilibrium where you have low quality of supply. There's a low effective price. So I'm going to underline effective price because the price per unit that the utility gets from selling is very low once you factor in theft and non-payment. And you have a situation then which is just not conducive for long-run growth and development. So these are the challenges. Many people are very familiar with these challenges. But when we think about the opportunities, I think the lessons from abroad can tell us a few things. First, it tells us that we need to really get at this question of how do we address the fundamental issue that electricity is not paid for, whether this is through social norms or through changing incentives on the collection side or on the payment side. There's a lot of thinking that can be done on how to improve this. And secondly, we can take a lot of optimism from the role of technologies, whether it's smart metering or aerial bundle cables, to address some of these issues that we see in distribution. And ultimately, I would suppose that the overarching argument is that to expand access to energy, to enable Pakistan to grow, it's going to require a serious improvement in the functioning of the distribution sector. And this requires addressing some of these underlying issues. So to begin, I will start with a background. So this will be to develop, if you will, my kind of conceptual thinking about how we should approach the problem. The starting point is maybe an obvious one, but it's that energy is essential for growth and development. And whether it was the United Kingdom during the Industrial Revolution, South Korea in the 1960s and 70s, no country has become rich without first consuming more energy. Of course, wealth creates opportunities to consume energy, but we likewise also believe that energy creates opportunities to create wealth. And you can see here Pakistan is kind of in the bottom quadrant, if you will, where it's just beginning its growth journey in terms of increasing its energy consumption per capita, but also its income per capita as well. So how is Pakistan going to get from the bottom left in this graph to the top right? Well, one simple correlation is that the expansion of access to energy rests on reducing losses. So on this graph, on the x-axis are the transmission and distribution losses for a variety of countries. This is World Bank data. And on the y-axis, you could have easily plotted GDP per capita as well as energy consumption per capita. You see this clear relationship between the, let's say, efficiency of the transmission and distribution system and not only income, but the energy access that these countries have. So, of course, we won't get into debates on correlation versus causation here, but the clear trend is that expanding access to energy goes hand in hand with reducing losses in transmission and distribution. So what is the challenge? The challenge that I conceptually want to develop is that if you have a leaky bucket, it does not make sense to necessarily keep adding more water. And this is not Pakistan specific, but developing countries have long focused on increasing supply. It's something that's tangible, it's visible, and important. There's no doubt about the need to increase generation capacity. But at the same time, they've also then tended to focus on keeping energy affordable by providing generous subsidies. So the subsidy question is something we'll discuss a bit later in the presentation, and there's a lot of interesting angles to it. But what has happened historically across a variety of contexts is that improvements in distribution have tended to get neglected. And the result, as we know, is that theft and non-payment of bills are widespread. But what happens is that utilities who provide these electricity services get squeezed on both ends. So they are not able to recover the cost of selling electricity, but as a result of this, they're not able to make payments for purchasing electricity. So that's the classic story in Pakistan. And equally, they're not able to make investments into maintaining the quality of supply that's necessary. And so what happens is that the only rational response, given that utilities can't shut down, if a utility was a private company and it had this situation where it was losing so much money because of theft or the price was too low, then they would have shut down operations. But naturally, this is not a feasible response because utilities are public entities or they're providing a public service. And so instead of shutting down, their natural coping mechanism is to actually restrict supply. So load shedding, of course, there's a technical aspect, which is managing the grid and kind of balancing supply and demand. But there's also this additional aspect, which because of the revenue situation, it makes sense for utilities to actually restrict supply. And what ends up happening is that because of this load shedding, or because of the erratic supply, the willingness to pay from existing customers goes down. So the value of having electricity actually goes down further. And that in itself then makes the incentive to pay for it go down. And so this vicious cycle forms. So there's many different angles, many different definitions of what we call a circular debt. But I think these utility and distribution, which is struggling to stay afloat, and that it has to take these responses to keep itself above water. And so what ends up happening is that because energy is mispriced or not paid for, our original goal of expanding access to energy actually suffers. So the overall access declines as a result of these coping responses by utilities. So that's pretty conceptual, but let's start thinking about this a bit more in practice. So how does this debt emerge? So on the left-hand side, and I'll be pulling quite regularly from experience in Bihar, India, where there's been a long standing research work done by colleagues at the University of Chicago, the London School of Economics, and Yale University. And so in some sense, Bihar, India is, Pakistan even worse in the sense that the situation is much more dire there. And here you can see the following. So each of these plots is the cost kind of per unit of electricity. So what ends up happening is that first on the far left, you have the official rate. So this is the price that you should be getting per unit. But what you actually want to do is to uncover what the actual revenue rate per unit will be in the setting. Once you deduct technical losses, once you deduct unbilled power, and once you deduct unpaid bills. So let me unpack that. So there's a lot happening here. Let's focus on the left-hand side graph. So the first difference between the blue line and the red dashed line indicates the role of subsidies. So number one, without subsidies, the utility would not be able to cover the cost of supply at all. So it must get subsidized in this case. But then you have technical losses. So naturally, just by the extent to which infrastructure is aged and needs to be maintained, you have technical losses from the point of generation in the power plant to the household itself. And this can be several percentage points of losses. But then the big drop tends to come from unbilled power. So unbilled power is consumption which is not even being picked up on the radar. So this is the outright theft. These are the kunda, the illegal lines that bypass the meter and are not covered by the utility itself. Then beyond that, you have the unpaid bills. So this is what we call recovery. And once you start adding up these technical losses, the outright theft, and the unpaid bills, what starts off as a reasonable rate, so it looks at the far left that the utility should be able to stay afloat. But once we factor in all these other considerations, we see that the revenue that the utility is making is not able to cover the cost of supply. And so this in some sense is a very kind of basic genesis of how these debt problems begin to arise. Of course, I think I should step back and say there's many more things at play in each specific context. In Pakistan, of course, there's a lot of issues around the ability for, historically, the ability for distribution companies to get subsidies paid on time, for instance. But I'm trying to really focus on the pure mechanics of this. And so we can develop an argument in kind of 4 steps on how this circular debt or an indebted distribution sector emerges. So the first step, and here actually would be very interesting to hear the views of the participants, but the first step is that the root cause of why you see such extensive theft or large-scale non-payment of bills is that in some senses, electricity is treated as a right. Now, this can be kind of contentious framing of the statement, but the idea is that on average, people in developing countries tend to either think that electricity is a public good, which should be given to them, and is not a private good, which they need to pay for, or they think that the consequences of not paying for electricity or stealing electricity are relatively minimal. So in this table, you can see just a large household survey of households in Bihar, India. And you can see that the vast majority of households, and I should say these households cover rich and poor alike, these households think that there's no consequences, that they will get punished or get penalized from paying your bill late, from modifying your meter, having an informal connection, or even bribing officials. And so whether this is a right story or whether it's a story about people thinking that the consequences of theft are minimal, kind of depends on what we then think will impact how we think the proposed solutions should be. But some evidence that might suggest that, at least in India, there's this notion that electricity is seen as a right, is that, you know, among the poor, they spend, for instance, 3 times as much on mobile phones than they do for electricity. And so this would suggest that if electricity was really something which they valued and wished to pay for, we would imagine that the benefits of electricity potentially outweigh those of having a mobile phone. And so the kind of expenditure share on electricity is incredibly low, which suggests that this might be an issue as well. So what I would like to, it's an open question if there's people who have comments, it'd be interesting to hear your views as to whether you think this applies to Pakistan as well, whether people have the sense that electricity is a right and is not something that I necessarily need to pay for. I think it's certainly clear the latter, that, you know, the consequences for theft are not particularly high or unlikely. But on this whether electricity is a right question, it'd be very interesting to get people's views on this point. So the second aspect, which I've touched on a little bit, is that this kind of part of step 1, which relates to the emergence of this non-payment and the emergence of the revenue problem, is that there are also explicit subsidies in the marginal price of power. So in this graph, on the x-axis, you just have the monthly electricity consumption. On the y-axis, you'd have the marginal price, so about the price per unit in US dollars. So you can see here that the top line is the marginal price for the high income countries. And then it goes from high income to upper middle to lower middle to low income. So the first thing we see here is that even for the rich high-end users, so let's imagine we're looking at 750 plus units per month, which is a lot of consumption, the marginal price of electricity still remains low compared to what a developed country charges. Okay, maybe that's not the fairest comparison, but certainly the idea is that we wouldn't expect the marginal cost of electricity to vary so widely necessarily across these contexts. And so this gap does emerge. So when you look at Pakistan here, you see that it kind of follows quite closely, for instance, the trends that we've seen in these lower and upper middle income countries. And so in that sense, the idea that there are explicit subsidies in the marginal price of power certainly bears out in the Pakistan context as well.
Tim, there are some clarification questions, if I can interrupt you for a minute. So Rashid Aziz is asking about the source of the graphs you showed on slide 6 on tariffs and revenues, because he's saying no one in Pakistan might believe these numbers. We often hear that the cost of power is high in Pakistan, higher than in other regional countries. These graphs say the opposite, and I would like to know the source.
So yes, thanks for the question. So this is not, I should have been clear, this is the cost of supply from the distribution company's end. This is not the generation cost. So this would reflect the power purchase price for distribution companies. And this is from publicly available NEPRA data.
Okay. And then there's one more question by Sadia Hussain. She's asking that, does this mean that price is competitively set?
So in terms of, so no, it's not competitively set. Pakistan does not have a wholesale market for electricity generation. Instead, the prices for generation are negotiated on kind of take or pay or take and pay contracts. And so likewise, there's a single buyer and seller, like minus so at least for the majority of the distribution companies in Pakistan, they purchase, everyone sells to CPPA, and then all the discos purchase from CPPA as well. So it's not that you have a competitive market for electricity generation or retail distribution.
Thank you.
So the second step, so first step highlights the emergence of the revenue problems. The second step really is that because electricity is seen as a right and because it's heavily subsidized, we start seeing loss-making enterprises in distribution. So this graph shows the average monthly consumption on the x-axis. There's a lot going on. So the bar chart is the fraction of consumers, and this is in Bihar, India. The bar chart is the fraction of consumers, and you'll see that the average consumer maybe consumes around 100 units or just under a month. So what I want to draw your attention to are the two dashed lines. So the first dashed line, the bill payment rate, which you look at the right axis, shows basically the percentage of the bill that gets paid in a given month. So over time, they might pay back the entire value of the bill, but at least in a given month, you see that the repayment rate is very low. Secondly, and that this is not particularly correlated with the actual amount of consumption. Secondly, if you look at the cumulative share, so the dotted line, you can see that around the midpoint, so the average consumer, so maybe around 100 units, you see losses around the cumulative distribution of collection losses is around 50%. So this is saying that half of the losses still come from kind of above average users. The idea is that losses are not necessarily, and certainly do not only come from the poor. Often there's a sense that theft and non-payment is conflated with the ability to pay. I think that's certainly a challenge and something which must be kept in mind when setting tariffs. But it is not the case that everyone who is able to pay does pay. And so theft and non-payment, and this is applicable to a variety of contexts, does also apply to the relatively richer class of consumers. And so the notion that it's only those in the bottom end of the distribution who don't pay their bills, and that's where the source of the debt comes from, that is not correct. So once we have electricity distribution system, which is loss-making, the third step is that utilities ration supply. So that, as I've mentioned, is one view of how they cope with this situation where the loss per unit sold is increasing. So the only response is to pull back supply. So here you can just see the cumulative distribution of load shedding across feeders in India. And you'll see the rough trend where 60%, for instance, of rural households, rural feeders in India have less than 14 hours of supply a day. Whereas in urban communities, it's about 20 to 21 hours of supply. But the reality is that there is not 24/7 access to electricity, and that this load shedding is coming as part from the revenue situation that the utility faces. So why is this a challenge? Well, this is a challenge because it effectively has meant the following, that there's a delink between supply and payment for electricity. And as the amount of hours of electricity goes down, then you end up in the situation where the kind of price per unit effectively charged that's necessary to start breaking even starts increasing as well. But here's an interesting graph, which is that often, and this does not actually apply to Pakistan, we'll discuss this, often the challenge is that there's no correlation between the supply and the amount that you pay. So here's all these dots. I'll speed up a little bit, but here's some of the linear fit. The red line shows the relationship between the hours of supply you get and the amount of electricity that's paid for in a given feeder. So this is basically showing that the supply is not linked to payment, and that breaks this whole market where in theory you should be having paying areas get the supply, and areas which don't pay for electricity shouldn't have the good provided. And so this is kind of evidence that this often breaks down. So in Pakistan's case is actually different, and we'll talk about that. So I want to now kind of take it a bit more to Pakistan. This is the kind of background and how one might think about the challenges in the sector. So the first question which I've thrown out, which I don't have an answer to, and it's an interesting one to think about, is whether step one holds. Is electricity treated as a right in Pakistan by the average person? It's an interesting question to think about, and how does that feed into their decisions about repayment? We do know that electricity is quite widely subsidized in Pakistan. And we do know that electricity distribution is loss-making. And as a result, that there is load shedding or some rationing of supply. I should caveat this and say that the situation has improved significantly in the last few years. But overall, these trends are still there. And what we don't have actually in Pakistan is this other kind of typical step which you'd see in other countries, which is that there's this delinking between supply and payment. And so Pakistan for the last several years has had an explicit rule that links the supply of electricity to an area, to a feeder, based on the payment or the losses that feeder has. And so that actually is an important and interesting step, though not without its flaws, that can start addressing some of these issues around the payment problem. So I'll very quickly now just throw some descriptive statistics and facts about the current situation in Pakistan and how I interpret some of these thoughts in the context of these dynamics that I've laid out. So the first fact, and this is just from the federal budget, is that energy subsidies remain substantial. They are coming down significantly, but if you look at the size of energy subsidies, this includes petroleum, the size of these subsidies are very large, even relative to social protection or education expenditures. And where does a lot of the subsidy come from? The existing tariff structure, for instance, works in the way that the majority of consumers receive a subsidy on their consumption. And so, for instance, with the tariff differential subsidy, so what happens is that there is a kind of a uniform price which is set, but then a subsidy comes in to lower the price. There's a price that's set for discos, and then a subsidy comes in to make a uniform price for consumers. And this is applied to so it's applied to the vast majority of consumers based on the block structure. I won't go into the details. I'm happy to answer questions, but in the current setup, the marginal price has this classic progressive structure where the price per unit goes up significantly the more units you consume, but you still receive benefits from the previous block. And so that is one source of where you get a lot of the increase in subsidy, for instance. But what I actually want to focus on and kind of throw out some open questions to think about is, everyone discusses subsidies, everyone knows the energy sector is subsidized, but what I want to think about is whether raising the price of energy is the right answer. I don't have an answer to this myself, and I'm not taking any stance on this, but you can see kind of two arguments for this. One argument is that conceptually, if the price is below marginal cost, then this means that there's an efficient use of electricity. So raising the price right now, so assuming for those users that the price is below marginal cost, that raising it might be helpful from an efficiency point of view. Another argument might just be that we have no choice and that it's a difficult decision, but revenue has to go up. So how would you push back to that? You might say that, okay, once you add in these other dimensions, so I've just been really focusing on the marginal price, but there's many other components which determine the bill that a consumer faces in Pakistan, like the fuel price adjustment, the quarterly tariff adjustment. Once you factor these in, the price is already quite high. And if you look at industry, I've been leaning more on residential consumers, but if you look at industries, they face relatively high rates and they're used currently to cross-subsidize residential users. So raising prices on industry in that sense might not be the best response. Another aspect to think about, which I think is quite relevant in this context, where there's not much evidence even internationally, is what happens to this dynamic of repayment and theft. So traditionally, economists think about raising prices and thinking about the price elasticity of demand and what that means for revenue. So imagine a very classic income tax question of what income tax rate do I set in order to maximize the revenue? You need to think about the elasticity of taxable income. So how do people shift their reported income as a response to the tax rate? I think on the energy sector side, this is also an interesting dynamic, which a number hasn't really been pinned down yet, which is that raising the price of energy, we would expect, would lead to lower recovery and raise theft. So it's not as simple as suggesting that raising the prices of energy necessarily translate to kind of increases in revenue, even taking into account the demand side response. So what we care about is the revenue collected at the end of the day, not just kind of the book value or the upfront value of revenue that we should be getting. And so an additional final point might then say, where capacity charges are very high, we actually want to do the opposite, where we want to encourage consumption. And that's actually an interesting feature, which I'll discuss. So the second fact, which everyone knows, is that most discos struggle to avoid losses. And there have been some discos which have sustained improvements in reducing losses, but overall, the loss situation remains a challenge. And if you were to put a headline figure on it, once you take into account the losses from unbilled power, as well as losses from the lack of recovery of these bills, you get a figure around 71% of units only get paid for at the end of the day. So maybe over time, this figure rises as recovery increases, but you currently have a situation where a large chunk of units just simply aren't paid for. And this is a challenge, naturally, because of the aspects that I mentioned. Now, lastly, you have this same issue of supply rationing. And I think one thing which is interesting is that the legacy of kind of peak demand surpassing generation capability it seems behind Pakistan. And there's a lot of kind of factors behind this, but the idea, at least currently, we're entering a period of what seems like relative surplus. And so we do, I think, see reductions in rationing and in kind of load shedding that's happened as a result. But the point I want to make is that the continuation of this supply rationing is likely going to be because of these factors that we've seen and discussed, that the loss-making side of the distribution exercise necessitates a need for these utilities to potentially scale back the supply of power, even though there might be surplus generation capability to supply these areas. Now, this is old data, so this is again all publicly available. This is from just an illustration that load shedding takes place. So this is LESCO in 2018, and I should note quite upfront that the situation has improved since then. But you can see that load shedding still takes place across a number of feeders and across different points in the day. So just lastly, I want to close in the last 5 minutes or so with a kind of few points on why I think Pakistan, while it has attributes that can fit some of these classic challenges that face the distribution sector in the developing world, some of the unique challenges, and I'm sure I'm not covering all of the areas here, and I'd love to hear people's comments and thoughts. But number one, Pakistan is incredibly diverse. And I think when you look at the different distribution companies, there's an incredible variation from incredibly well-performing distribution companies, where everything that I'm saying, frankly, is less applicable, where their losses are kept down and they do an excellent job in recovering bills. But then you also have struggling discos, which, whether it's recovery or outright theft or kind of the quality of infrastructure, each disco can face their own challenges. And I think that's going to be essential. And when you look at the supply side, I focused a lot on distribution because I think often the discussion tends to focus on the supply side. And I thought this would be an interesting angle, but there's certainly challenges on the supply side pertaining to whether the kind of generation costs are on par with what we might expect in a good functioning system. And I think one item in particular is that the recent challenge that's emerging is that these low utilization factors, so power plants have a lot of capacity which is left idle and isn't being utilized to generate electricity. It's meant that these capacity payments are incredibly high. And a quick illustration of this is that, again, this is from NEPRA. If you just look very roughly at the installed capacity in blue and the generation of electricity in orange, you can see that generation is not necessarily kept up with installed capacity. And I'm not the expert in explaining why these gaps exist, but a key challenge, certainly for Pakistan's context currently, is that these capacity payments, because of the existing structure of these contracts, are very high. And so even though electricity isn't being generated, power plants are receiving payments, and this makes it a bit of a challenge for the sector. And that's why I made that point earlier on, we might actually want to encourage more consumption of electricity in this point of time. So to close, and then I'd open up for some questions, I want to take some lessons, very broad, high-level lessons, and think about, really just posit some questions on the Pakistan context. So one option which is historically provided to address this challenge is to create explicit incentives for reducing losses. So one option has been to link the supply of electricity to payment of bills. So Pakistan has for several years now had a revenue-linked supply scheme, RLSS, in place. And what happens is that high-loss feeders receive less supply, or they get load shedded more, even if there is kind of existing system capacity to supply this feeder. Now, what this basically means is that if you're a well-paying customer in a kind of overall poorly paying feeder, so if I'm paying but others around me are not, I will still get lower supply as a result. And so while this is important in establishing this link between payment and supply, which I've documented doesn't exist systematically in other countries, so this is an important step, we might have open questions about whether the system is fair. And I would actually like to know if people were broadly familiar with the fact that one reason why they may be getting load shedding is simply because their current location is one which others don't pay for their bills. And so that's one option to think about. Now, another item I'd like to just think about is, what can we do in terms of interventions that might support the functioning of a utility? And we've seen evidence from India and other contexts that providing direct incentives to, say, bill collectors can actually be quite rewarding. So in Pakistan, there's a lot of famous work on kind of performance-based pay for tax collectors. We've seen the same for utility officials in India, where by setting performance targets, you actually are able to significantly increase revenue in a short span of time, which suggests that there's some dynamic at the stage of collection, which might be preventing the ability to collect bills and collect revenue for the sector. So that's the one hand, you can provide incentives for, say, the officials to increase revenue, but you can also try to enforce more strongly and make the repercussions of non-payment much higher. And for instance, in Pakistan's context, there's been some legal changes where theft is now, I believe, a crime, for instance. But there's a lot more that you can think about. How do we ensure that these recovery rates increase? But even stepping back, one lesson is that, fine, we can provide all these incentives. We can think about ways to create incentives for reducing losses. But one view, and this is by no means the sole view on the question, but one view is even more broader and thinks about the need to change social norms on theft. Right now, if you ask someone whether paying your bill is a crime or if it's theft, they'll probably say no. They'll probably say, maybe the social contract is missing, so why should I pay for something like this if I don't feel like I'm getting adequately rewarded? But the goal at the end of the day is to move everyone to this high quality, low theft equilibrium. And there's many ideas, and I'd like to hear your ideas on how we could do that. And maybe in very rural areas, this revolves less on government intervention, more on community institutions. And after all, there's an incentive for these institutions to push for greater community repayment. And it would be interesting to see that the role of these local community groups, it could even be religious institutions, play in kind of encouraging the proper behavior and kind of discouraging the theft or non-payment of bills. And then lastly, technology is your friend, though I should say it is not a silver bullet. So we've seen from ongoing experiments in South Africa and other utilities that smart meters and prepaid meters can play an interesting role in addressing some of these challenges. So smart meters would allow for a much more targeted link between supply and payment that doesn't have this large scale externality on others. So you could disconnect individual transformers potentially, or even individual households remotely if they're not paying. So that's smart meters. Prepaid meters could be helpful by helping managers helping customers manage consumption, and by design make it much harder to just not pay for your bills, because you need to top up very much like a mobile phone before you can get electricity as well. And then there's other forms of infrastructure or technology broadly that will help make outright theft a much greater challenge, where you can't just hook up so easily. But I think my overall kind of sense from the literature is that these technologies are very expensive to scale, and that they must be tailored to the local context. And if you really want to take advantage of them, we need to think quite closely about the incentives problem as well. So technology can play a big role in fixing some of these, but without kind of addressing the underlying incentives, it might not be a sustainable solution out of the situation. So I've gone on a bit longer than I planned, but to summarize and to close, I think if you were to look at the challenges that Pakistan faces in its energy sector, they are quite similar to challenges we've seen elsewhere. And I think there's a clear need, and I think this has received naturally a lot of focus on how to improve the distribution side of things. And I hope some of these ideas and some of the framing that I've brought to this in terms of how to think about some of the issues could be helpful when thinking and discussing about possible solutions in the Pakistan context. And so in that, I'll pause, and I'd love to hear any comments and questions that others have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. This was very interesting. As you rightly pointed out when you started, this is actually one of our favorite topics. So I can see a lot of questions in chat as well. I'll start with one clarification questions, and then I like to unmute some of the people who've asked questions. So Junaid Khan is basically asking, do you have a sense of the proportion of unpaid bills that are from government departments and how that might be impacting the recovery rates?
So no, unfortunately, I don't know. Sorry.
And then I'm trying to get Ali Aslam to unmute. If you can please ask your question.
Inviting and giving us the chance to participate in this. My understanding of the Pakistan power sector is that over the past few years, we have significantly worked on reducing the marginal cost. That is, we have moved from the inefficient and expensive fuel plants to efficient and low cost fuels. You can debate on the environmental concern of the coal and but RLNG is better, but that's another debate. But I'm not getting into that. But the cost is reducing in terms of producing a unit. But there are fixed costs associated with it. The kind of return structure, causa that return structure we have in Pakistan, and where the project debt is front loaded and it's being paid in the first 10 years or so in any project. So when these new projects are coming online with the and to show that 80% of that project is debt to equity. So with the huge debt is to be paid in the 20 years, and in the 10 years when the equity 20% is to be paid in 25, 30 years. So in the early part of the project, there's a high fixed cost associated with it. And now with this high fixed cost, that can only be justified to reduce the overall cost is by increasing the pie. I mean, if Pakistan, if I contextualize in this way, if Pakistan is producing 120 billion kilowatt hours or units of electricity through its main NTDC system, it can potentially go up to 150 billion units today and can go up to 180 billion units in the future based on the new power plants coming online. So if we increase to that higher number, so the fixed cost component would dilute. But the problem is that the electricity price is high. There is no incentive for new people to move in, and those who have the option to go for alternate, because in days of load shedding, many industries have came up with their captive arrangement, and they're moving towards the captive arrangement, which is even more inefficient. The captive plants are inefficient, and they're using the furnace oil in the captive plants of 25% versus electricity coming from RLNG 60% efficiency plant, because they pay the price including every loss and everything, and they weighted average this and pass it on. But if the marginal cost of that RLNG plant is much lower than the marginal cost of that captive plant they're using, but they're still using the captive plant. So the structure of pricing has to change. So wherever you have slightly above the marginal cost, if you keep on selling to the industry and keep on expanding the pie, your fixed cost would be covering, and that's the way to come out of this circular debt. That's one thing which I like to hear about. How do you say about this? And on the theft issue, I mean, yes, you're right that with the law and everything, you can work out, and you gave a brilliant example of Bihar over there. But when we see in Pakistan, in a city like Lahore or Faisalabad or Islamabad, which are big cities, and they have good industrial plants in the mix as well, their theft is much low. Their recovery, if you see the disclosed data, their recovery is 95% plus, and even that. So the theft issue is not really there, where you have some kind of rate of the government and everything. But there are places where the rate of the government is weak, and they are the places where where one form or the other government is is not paying bill. It's the defaulter. You would see the examples in KPK, you would see the example in Balochistan, you would see those examples in cities of Sindh, where you will see that the government is not paying bill, and where the government is probably some part of the provincial government, the local government, while that distribution company comes under the ambit of the federal government. So the communication is not there, and those who are taking the liability uh, are not enjoying from the benefit of the threat or whatever it is. So that's one area. And then there are political economic issues, so that their stance from those people over there, that they're producing low marginal cost electricity. For instance, in KP, they're producing this a hydel electricity, which is a low marginal cost, and they're paying so much high on that. Why should they pay that? And then somehow some elements, political elements in the government support them, in the provincial government and the local government setup. And then the argument coming from the same the Balochistan, that we are providing the cheap gas to the rest of the country, but they are getting in turn electricity very expensive. So they are political economic questions, which cannot be just addressed through this changing the law and the theft and all that. So these are the two elements which I would like you to give me some insight to how can we work on those, because these are the two basic issues in my humble opinion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think that's an excellent comment, and I agree with a lot of what you've said. And I think first you're right, on the graph that I showed, and I think Rashid Saab also raised a question about the marginal cost here. I fully agree that that is just a simple kind of description of what's happening. Covering these fixed costs will be incredibly important. And frankly, I don't have a better answer to your question than what you've laid out in your comment. I think you've really hit the nail on the head with some of these challenges with respect to fixed costs of production. And so it's an interesting dynamic where, as I've said, there is a lot of pressure to raise prices. But given these dynamics locally, it is an open question still, and you need more evidence to think about, whether raising these prices is the best thing to do, given these high fixed costs, which would actually incentivize you to increase consumption, but then also given these potential current concerns around repayment. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a kind of explicit answer to your points, but I think these are really well taken, and it's certainly something that I'll keep in mind as we start doing more work on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And so because we're running short on time, I'll want to request all of the other people who are going to ask questions to keep their comments to, well, brief questions in the first place. And if it's a comment, please keep it to a brief comment. Next up, we have Ali Khurshid. I think you're unmuted now.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the presentation. I just had a question on the generation side in Pakistan. The government actually tried to renegotiate the contracts with a lot of independent power producers recently. So now their contracts on tariff and other terms of the power purchase agreement have been renegotiated. My question is, do you have any examples of how any other governments in the region tried to do this, and how was the experience, and did it really bring about a change in a decline in the overall basket price of electricity that was being produced? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think the reality is it's very opaque. It's hard to know exactly kind of when countries negotiate or renegotiate these power purchase agreements, the process that goes behind there. But I think what we do see is that this is a natural process as the country starts moving towards creating a real market for electricity, so a wholesale market. And I think they're very difficult negotiations. And I think my sense is that the steps that are being taken are the right ones. And yeah, you want to start moving to a system where instead of having long-term contracts, you have a system where it's much more based on the competitive bidding. And so I think this is a natural evolution that power sectors undertake as they kind of grow from kind of a lower middle income country to an upper and developed country status. So I think it's a challenging process, but I think it's necessary. And so I certainly think that there's some evidence that when you start moving towards these more wholesale markets for electricity, where you have competitive bidding, that does translate to reductions in the cost of generation. So I think that I see this as part of a longer process towards that.
Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Farooq Iqbal, if you would please like to ask your question.
Yes, please. Thank you. I noticed from the very interesting graph that you provided of comparative losses across discos that K Electric was the only one which had reduced its losses from around the 30% range to perhaps the low 20s. Could you tell us a little bit about how K Electric was able to reduce its losses? Perhaps there are lessons there for the other discos as well. Thank you.
I think that's a great question. So I must say I'm not an expert on what K Electric has done. I think certainly it does raise the interesting question of to what extent does providing private incentives for distribution companies translate to better outcomes, at least in terms of the ability to reduce losses. So we might have evidence, for instance, from K Electric that there's this positive trend and that the move towards privatization could have helped that. But I think there's many other dimensions as well to this question. So frankly, I think it's an area which is understudied in the literature. You don't have that many examples actually where you have a quick move to a private distribution that you can then try to monitor the effects in terms of losses over time. Because often what you have and what Pakistan has is this hybrid setup of distribution and transmission and generation where you have state actors, you've got private actors, and they're all intermingling with one another. But I certainly think that looking at the Karachi Electric experience could offer some interesting insight to lessons for other discos as well.
Thank you, Tim. We have a number of raised hands, and if you're able to stay for 5 more minutes, I'd like to give everyone a chance to ask their questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So next we have Naila Tasneem.
Thank you. I actually couldn't hear the entire presentation, but I had just two questions about the circular debt problem. So firstly, how do you perceive the role of subsidies in affecting the circular debt of Pakistan? I mean, subsidies are common like in a lot of other developing countries like Latin America, and even in Pakistan, the industrial sector demanding the government they should be providing subsidies on utilities. So while looking at the circular debt problem, I would like to know if you actually got a chance to look at the role of subsidies that the government provides on electricity and whether it was having any impact on the circular debt. And secondly, my second part of the question is actually about the regulation of price of electricity in Pakistan. So, while looking at Pakistan and considering like international experience debt, who do you think should be responsible for price regulation? Do you think it should be the government ultimately that should be deciding on that, or whether it should be something that some autonomous body or electricity companies should be determining? Thank you.
Feeds into the stock of debt in the power sector. It depends on whether the subsidy is held on the books of the power sector, if it's held elsewhere in the government. But it certainly is an element of the circular debt more broadly. And I think I don't want to make a blanket statement on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I think there's, as I've mentioned in my presentation, there are many positive reasons for why you may want to have subsidies, whether it's for equity reasons to ensure some lifeline usage of electricity, or if it's for supporting strategic industry. And so I think it's certainly an element. The solution is to start thinking a bit more about how do we reform and think about targeting such subsidies. And so I think in that regard, it's an element, certainly a key feature of the debt, but it's not something which is very easy to remove, nor should you necessarily go after it right away. So I think it's a key component, but I would say the core drivers beyond subsidies are just these dynamics around difficulties in enforcing payments of electricity and reducing theft. Then secondly, I think on your question relating to regulation of prices, standard best practice would suggest that you have an independent regulator, as Pakistan currently does. The government is involved in coming in and choosing how to subsidize electricity, but I think that's naturally under the purview of the government to make that decision. And so again, it's difficult to say whether there's a better system right now. But what I can say is that, you know, if you look at more developed like power sectors, you would have a situation where you have kind of retail competition. So you would have an independent regulator who probably sets limits within the range of prices that can be charged. And this can be varying across geographies in a country. But within those price limits, you have different companies who basically compete to try to offer you electricity. So there's competition on the distribution of electricity as well. And so in that dimension, you do see electricity companies competing over prices for electricity to customers within some certain range as well. And so that is kind of a long-term vision, if you will, for what a power sector might look like in Pakistan as well. So there's a kind of combination of having some regulation, but introducing competition in supply. I would just quickly like to, I've noticed in the comments that there was a comment on kind of what Karachi Electric has done based on my previous question. And so they highlighted that there was a push on kind of restricting supply on feeders that are high loss, and also kind of changes to the process of collecting bills. So that could be kind of interesting lessons to learn a bit more about.
Thank you. Next we have Dr. Ijaz Nabi, and then I think I will have to restrict it to one last question after that. Thank you, everyone.
This is more by way of information than a question, and this is responding to Dr. Farooq Iqbal's query about the lessons from Karachi Electric Company. Farooq, you'd be pleased to know that the newly appointed Special Assistant to the Prime Minister on the power sector is Tabish, the gentleman who helped set up Karachi Electric's system, which delivered the results that you are impressed by. So hopefully he will bring with him the lessons that can be applied to other discourse.
Thank you. So we also have, I think, Javed Yunus, if you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Tim, and everyone. So this is, again, a comment, not a question, basically, in response to what Dr. Farooq Iqbal asked about Karachi electricity. So I have a paper with my co-author, Dr. Aisha Ali. She presented this paper like a week ago at LUMS. So one thing that Karachi Electric did and that we studied, that they initiated a policy where they increased load shedding in the areas which were high loss areas and decreased load shedding in the areas which were low loss area. So basically they prepared a schedule according to which the high loss areas were, you can say, reprimanded in terms of increasing load shedding, and low loss areas were actually rewarded by decreasing load shedding in that area. And what we found in that paper, that policy actually worked. And there were a couple of initiatives that Karachi Electric has been taking in Karachi. One was that the Kunda culture was very widespread. Kunda culture means that hooking the wires with the main poles and using electricity from that, like stealing electricity. That culture was very widespread. And then there were many areas in Karachi where there were no meters. So people were built based on actually the Kunda. So basically, Kunda was up to some point was legal way of getting electricity in Karachi. So then Karachi Electric started installing meters in those areas. And then KE also took many other initiative, engaging community, engaging religious leaders to counsel people or interact with the people, giving them some moral lessons and so on. So I think together all these policies have worked in the favor of KE in improving bill payments and reducing theft. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Tim. I think I'll have to put an end to the questions right now. And I apologize to people who've left questions in the Q&A. We will make sure that Tim gets these, and so perhaps he can answer you separately. But since we're over time, I would like to thank Tim again for his time today and for his very interesting presentation. For everyone who's still around, even though we're about 7 minutes over time. Just to announce our next seminar series. Seminar is going to be on the 20th of November by Nida Jamil from the Lahore School of Economics. She's going to be presenting on trading textiles along the New Silk Route, the effects of Pakistan's free trade agreement with China. And with that, I want to thank everyone again.